In 1968, the FAU formed ROE, the Workers' Student Resistance. For some time within the FAU, there had been discussion around the fact that there were many people who were not in unions but who were prepared and willing to fight in the class struggle. This included high school and college students, homemakers, unemployed people, and non-unionized workers. The outlawing of the FAU, which prevented them from organizing publicly, along with a militant student wave, inspired in part by the 1968 student movement, were the final pushes that led to the creation of ROE. To join ROE, you only needed to agree to a commitment to escalate social conflict through the coordination of struggles and the use of direct action. This organization is another example of a grouping of tendency. ROE, like the combative tendency, was an organization created by the specific anarchist organization to bring like-minded militants from the larger social movement together in an organization of their own. At its height, it had 500 members. While the activities the organization engaged in varied, some of the more common actions included what they called lightning actions, actions able to be done in under 5 minutes. Lightning actions included vandalism, traffic stops, graffiti campaigns, and building administration takeovers, and they were carried out by highly coordinated and disciplined groups amid demonstrations. Another common activity was producing research for militants and organizations during active struggles. Over the next 5 years, ROE was very active throughout Uruguay. It's hard to emphasize how much of an impact they had in the bitter fights of this time period. We'll take a look at just one battle they were involved in. Workers at a meat processing plant, 14,000 of them, earned 2 kilos of meat on top of their wages at the end of each shift. In April of 1969, it was announced they would no longer be receiving their 2 kilos of meat. The workers immediately went out on strike and set up an occupation outside of the factory. This immediate direct action taken by workers spoke loudly on its own. A number of FAU members worked at the factory and so were able to communicate the mood of the workers to the rest of the FAU, and both the FAU and ROE decided this was a fight they would be taking on. Roadblocks were set up to protect the occupation, and food deliveries and supermarket expropriations began to be conducted daily to feed the occupation. Each evening, intense fighting erupted when the police attempted to clear the camp and roadblocks. Workers with bats and knives and students in the trees of the boulevards launching steel pellets with their slingshots kept police at bay. Early into the struggle, the police commissioner's house was bombed. Reproducing the camp itself was done in large part by women, the amas de casas. With this reproductive labor, they were no longer reproducing workers to go to work, but their work was instead reproducing a different form of life. They did laundry, cooked large communal meals, solicited donations for food, and spent nights roaming the city, posting flyers and doing graffiti supporting the strike. At one point in the months-long strike, police were able to battle their way through the barricades and clear the camp, and they began to use it as a staging area. However, the next night, workers fought them off and took back the occupation site. The strike spread to other workers, starting with the bank workers who walked out in solidarity. Rail workers refused to transport any meat, so the effects of the strike became acute. And when the companies turned to using trucks to transport the meat instead, they were set on fire. Bank workers refused to process checks for the meatpacking plants. ROE hunted down and beat police-associated writers who scabbed when journalists and graphic artists went on strike. Illegal work actions, including wildcat strikes, sabotage campaigns, vandalism, and censorship defiance, spread and escalated almost to a general strike. But in the end, most of the strike demands were not met, with the closure and relocation of many of the meat processing plants. However, when asked in an interview in recent years about ratios of wins and loses on the picket line, one FAU member replied, What do you mean you want to know if we won? You only win when you make the revolution. Now, we'll take a step back here and talk about a bit of the structure of the FAU itself. The FAU did and does not operate an open-door policy. Like a number of other especifist and anarchist communist organizations, one must first graduate through stages of political education, i.e., readings and discussions about the organization, its operating style, and its aims, activities, and methodology, before acceptance. There is then a 1-year delay before one can become a full member with all the associated entitlements. The organization requires a serious level of commitment, but unlike many nonprofit or activist orgs, the organization is committed to taking care of its members as well. It is a revolutionary organization, one with a very long-term perspective, and so the priority is taking good care of its members, not burning them out. There are different levels of membership in the FAU. In this diagram, you can see there are full militants in the middle, militants in the next ring, and supporters in the third ring. The levels here indicate both levels of commitment and responsibility, and a member chooses what level they want to be in. When it comes to decisions, there are some which are made only by meetings of full militants, according to the principle that if a member is doing the work, they should have a say in what is being done, and not have decisions made by those who aren't doing any of the work. In 1959, the Cuban Revolution occurred. It's hard to overstate how inspiring this was to revolutionaries around the world, particularly in Latin America. Moscow-aligned communist parties at this time were committed to an electoral strategy for socialism, and the Cuban Revolution appeared to show another way for many. The FAU, while critiquing the revolution's growing totalitarianism, its development of state capitalism, and its relationship with the USSR, had a strong perspective, influenced by Third Worldism, which critically supported the revolution as a blow against imperialism. Foquismo, the strategy of guerrilla warfare popularized by Che Guevara, inspired armed groups to spring up all over Latin America. Now, in Che's manual, called Guerrilla Warfare, the political aspects of the struggle are subordinate to the armed struggle. The masses are almost exclusively considered as support and cover for the military action, and their political and ideological conditions would develop as a consequence of armed struggle. Che also believed that repression breeds resistance, and that the repression the guerrillas invited would affect an increasingly broad sector of the population, which would increase sympathy for the guerrillas. On one hand, the FAU had significant criticisms of Foquismo. Included in this are Foucault's assumption that armed struggle would radicalize people ideologically, or that the worsening conditions of the people would have them join the revolutionary movement. This strategy converted the idea of insurrection from something the people build towards themselves into a grand myth, something achievable by a guerrilla vanguard and thus detached from everyday life. The FAU also challenged the assumption that repression breeds resistance. Instead, they argued that as repression increased, the armed apparatus would assume a more privileged or vanguard role. A guerrilla vanguard detached from everyday life was not seen as a path toward the transformation of the people. The FAU strongly believed that the people need to free themselves, to be participants in the revolution, not spectators. On the other hand, the FAU understood the need for armed struggle as part of a revolutionary process, and some FAU members were inspired to take up arms themselves. Thus, OPR 33 was born, the armed apparatus of the FAU. Members worked in cells of 3 to 6 and did not know other members of OPR 33 outside their cell. Unlike FOCO groups, it was determined that this armed apparatus would never become the protagonist of the struggle itself. FOIA'd declassified communications between the U.S. Embassy and the Uruguayan government, as well as internal industry publications of the capitalists in Uruguay from this period. Both confirm that the terrorism of some of the FOCO groups, such as the Tupamaros, were not actually as scary to the rulers as mass labor unrest was. Violence done by tactical experts, divorced from the everyday struggle of the people, was a losing strategy, one that turned the struggle into that of guerrillas on one side and the army and the police on the other, with the people caught in the middle. This resulted in the end of the Tupamaros in 1972 by assassination of their members, detention, and the dismantling of their infrastructure. The actions of OPR 33, in comparison, were always in service of active social struggles, often providing strike line defense or performing kidnappings of bosses and other strategic targets. In the first years of its existence, OPR 33 would take actions, but would do so secretly, without publicizing their existence at all. Initial actions started in 1968 with bank robberies to raise funds for imprisoned members and to finance the FAU's operations. Some FAU members were bank workers and provided intel for operations. The famous slogan, "Arriba los que luchan," hooray for those who fight, was actually coined during the getaway from their first bank robbery. As an example of how OPR 33 would contribute to a struggle, let's take a look at one particular fight, a strike at a shoe factory. The strike had been dragging on for months, and FAU militants working at the factory were not the only ones frustrated at how things had been going. They gauged most other workers would support an escalation, and so they let OPR 33 know. An OPR 33 cell then kidnapped the factory owner's son, who had been recruiting scabs from his neo-fascist organization. The ransom letter demanded that the owner meet the strike demands immediately, that the letter be published in a newspaper owned by a family friend of the factory owner, and that the factory owner provide school supplies to all children in the barrio surrounding the factory for the school year. The letter was published in the newspaper the next day, and all the demands of the strikers and kidnappers were met. Kidnapping for ransom eventually replaced bank robbery as a means to fund local activities of the organization, and later, to publicize the crimes of the dictatorship abroad. OPR 33 set a world record at the time for the largest ransom paid for a kidnapping, although it was by accident. The translator misheard dos as Dios, and so the kidnappers got a nice surprise when the briefcase they received contained $10 million instead of $2 million. While we're on the topic of Guinness World Records set by OPR 33, we'll mention another they helped set, the Punta Carretas prison escape. This operation involved 3 OPR 33 and 100 Tupamaro prisoners. They began by digging a 200-foot tunnel to a house nearby. Now, tunnels that long are difficult and dangerous to dig for a number of reasons. 1, lack of air circulation can be deadly. And 2, in a prison, you run out of places to put the dirt as you quickly dig it out. However, one reason they were able to successfully dig a tunnel that far was because they came across another tunnel, which they were able to use for both air and for the backfilling dirt as it was excavated. The tunnel they discovered had been used in the 1930s by a group of anarchists who had escaped the same prison. When the OPR 33 and Tupamaro prisoners finished their tunnel and escaped, it was the largest mass prison escape ever at the time. Many in OPR 33 were not gunslingers. The intelligence section of OPR 33 spent months on investigation prior to most actions, and much of their intelligence work never resulted in an action, but remained on file for potential future use. The Cholas were the action groups. They were the ones who carried out the high-risk actions, the kidnappings, and armed expropriations. Most maintained normal lives as students or workers, although some did live clandestinely. The violence group was responsible for tactical escalation during rallies or strikes. Their goal was to be a bridge between the armed apparatus and the mass movement, performing armed community defense on the picket lines or fighting police and scabs. Doing this in their own workplaces, they helped normalize class-based violence among other workers. Patriarchy was taken seriously within the FAU. They addressed this in a number of ways. The FAU paid special attention to reproductive labor within the organization and social movements, and they theorized about it. For example, with occupations and encampments, how did they reproduce themselves and reproduce new ways of being? How does the domestic world become a site of political militancy itself, with the domestic work having a social impact? Instead of valorizing frontline work as the real revolutionary work and demeaning feminized labor, the FAU recognized domestic workers as potential protagonists acting from within the space of the domestic sphere. Alternatively, instead of letting armed struggle be the domain of men, much of the actual work of OPR 33 itself was done by women and in women-led teams. Women self-organized to some degree within the FAU itself. For example, a FAU house named Casa Emma, after Emma Goldman, was a women-only house where, besides doing political work together, the residents lifted weights and trained in martial arts. Women in the FAU in recent interviews broadly have expressed feeling liberated in their work with FAU projects and emancipated via their roles in OPR 33. However, this is relative for the time, as a large portion of domestic work in the FAU was still performed by women.